This is Boniface from the blog and website Unam Sanctam Catholicam. Today is November 25th, 2012, the Feast of Christ the King, and the title of this reflection is The Social Kingship of Christ in the United States. And I thought that today on this Feast of Christ the King it would be good to reflect on what the social kingship of Christ means to a Catholic in modern America. I think to a large degree I'll probably be preaching to the choir here, but I did want to give an explanation, especially to many of our conservative friends of whatever religious affiliation, who are mystified that we don't jump on the back to the Constitution bandwagon. All authority ultimately comes from God. This is taught plainly in the scriptures and Christian tradition. This goes back to Christ's interview with Pontius Pilate when he tells Pilate that Pilate would have no authority over him if it had not been given from above. And in Romans 13, St. Paul says, quote, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed." That's Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. So all authority ultimately comes from God. There's not a civic authority that's independent of the authority of God. All human authority is bound up and dependent upon God's authority and established by God. Now the Feast of Christ the King calls to mind the social kingship of Christ. And that is the concept that Christ's reign is not just established over individuals, over particular souls, but whole societies, cultures, and nations as well. And that's just logical coherence. How could Christ have primacy over 100 individuals, singly but not collectively? In 1925, when the Feast of Christ the King was instituted, Pope Pius XI wrote in the encyclical Quas Primas in section 18, quote, "The empire of our Redeemer embraces all men. To use the words of our immortal predecessor, Pope Leo XIII, his empire includes not only Catholic nations, not only baptized persons, who, though of right belonging to the Church, have been led astray by error or cut off from her by schism, but also all of those who are outside the Christian faith, so that truly the whole of mankind is subject to the power of Jesus Christ. Nor is there any difference in this matter between the individual and the family or the state. For all men, whether collectively or individually, are under the dominion of Christ. In him is the salvation of the individual, in him is the salvation of society. Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given to men whereby we must be saved." End quote. So, it's not just the individual that has an obligation in justice to seek and render worship unto God, but society and government as well. Societies and governments are obliged to give public honor to Christ and let the gospel influence law and administration of the government. And this again going back to the notion that all authority ultimately comes from God, and because this authority comes from God as its source, human authorities render what is due to God by giving glory and honor to Christ, the King of Kings and the source of all authority. Now this Catholic teaching is quite different from the principles upon which our own nation was founded. Our nation was founded on the principles of the Deistic Enlightenment, especially the teachings of John Locke, and to a lesser degree Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who put forward a different concept of where the authority of government comes from. Locke and Rousseau were proponents of what's known as the social contract theory or the social compact, and ultimately this comes down to us in the phrase that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, a phrase that finds its way into our Declaration of Independence. notice that there's no reference to God. The authority doesn't descend from above, but it sort of arises from the consent of the governed. Never mind that how many of the governed need to give their consent is not addressed, or what constitutes consent. Does it need to be explicit, implicit? What is consent exactly? But the basic idea is that that government gets its authority from the consent of people who are willing to be governed by it. Now, if it's from the consent of man, then it is purely a human, man-focused institution with no place for God in the government. Now, the founders of our country knew this, and thus omitted any mention of God from the Constitution. Now, the dating of the Constitution in the year of our Lord is just a pro forma statement of how people dated things back then. The fact that it says in the year of our Lord doesn't make the Constitution Christian any more than the nation of India dating its official documents 2012 means India is a Christian nation, because they're using the Anno Domini dating system. There is no mention of God in the Constitution. It's conspicuously absent. The United States was set up as a purposefully secular state, the first such in the history of the world. So the conservative fable of the Christian founding of our nation is really a myth, and this is why, in my opinion, Catholics, especially traditional Catholics, can't jump on the back to the Constitution bandwagon. The Constitution itself is a secular document in which God and the social kingship of Christ are intentionally omitted and replaced with the principles of John Locke. A great example of this is the Treaty of Tripoli in June 1797 that comes to us out of the Barbary Wars with the Muslim corsairs of North Africa. And this document really bears witness to the intentional secularity of the United States government, and really puts a nail in the coffin of the myth of the Christian founding of the country. This treaty says, quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of the Muslims, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries." End quote. And I want to go back and stress the first sentence in the treaty, which is found in Article 11. The treaty begins again with the phrase, "As the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion." And then it goes on. This treaty was unanimously ratified in the Senate, 339-0, and signed by President John Adams. It was also published publicly, and nobody raised any dissent against it. And there's many other examples and documents we could cite, as evidence that the United States is founded as an intentionally secular country, and that is the intent of the founders, which conservatives are always talking about, going back to the intent of the founders and the Constitution. That's not going to help us from a Catholic perspective. Authority comes from God, and this is true in a democracy no less than in a monarchy. In democracy, what simply happens is that people choose who will be vested with this authority, and this is taught in Quas Primas by Pius XI. People choose who will be vested with the authority, but they do not in any sense delegate it to their elected officials. The concept of the authority of the government coming from the consent of the governed is a lie and a heresy. The Feast of Christ the King reminds us of the source of true authority and the duty of the government to render public homage to the King of Kings, even in the United States. May it be so. God bless you.